Welcome to In This Body, a podcast where we dive deep into the potent power of embodiment. I'm your host, Ailey Jolie, a psychotherapist deeply passionate about living life fully from the wisdom within your very own body. The podcast In This Body is a love letter to embodiment, a podcast dedicated to asking important questions like, how does connecting to your body change your life? How does connecting to your body enhance your capacity to love more deeply and live more authentically? And how can collective embodiment alter the course of our shared world? Join me for consciously curated conversations with leading experts. Each episode is intended to support you in reconnecting to your very own body. This podcast will be available for free wherever you get your podcasts, making it easy for you to stay connected to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Welcome back to In This Body. Today I'm honored to sit down once again with a guest whose work brings profound depth and nuance to the field of reproductive mental health. Kristen Portney. If you joined us for our first conversation, you'll remember Kristen's ability to hold space for the complexities of abortion, miscarriage, and embody grief with compassion and wisdom. Her approach to therapy is rooted in bridging polarities, exploring liminal spaces, and reclaiming embodiment through storytelling, meaning-making, and ritual too. In this second conversation, we're expanding the discussion today. We'll explore the narratives we inherit about reproduction and how they shape our relationships with our bodies. We'll talk about how reproductive trauma can impact pleasure and how pleasure itself can be a form of reclamation. And we'll discuss embodiment as a feminist practice, looking at how reclaiming the body can serve as both healing and resistance in a world that so often seeks to control women's bodies. We're also speaking at a critical time when reproductive rights are under increasing threat globally. We'll explore how these restrictions are shaping the way people experience their bodies, the stories they have around their reproductive health, and how somatic practices can offer support in a time of fear and uncertainty. Kristen, I'm so grateful to have you back for another conversation. Welcome to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. We've already had the chance to hear so much of your expertise and insight, and because I felt like the last time we saw each other, spent time together, there were so many more questions that I was left with. As soon as the recording ended, I wanted to have you back to dive just more into your work, what you offer, the perspective you hold, and how you support people. And one piece that really came alive for me when I was thinking about our time together, and also after, was how the narratives around reproductive health get absorbed into our unconscious, how they live in family systems, how they permeate through culture. And I would love to hear from you what type of narratives, consciously or in the implicit of your clients' bodies, that you often find yourself working with or supporting people to work through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question right off the bat. And I also just want to say that I left our first episode also just feeling so many sparks going off in my brain. I'm like, oh, this and this and this and this. So I'm very happy to be back. One narrative that I want to start with, and that I think is really important because it's being very clearly, acted out in the U.S. is like who should be a mother and who gets to be a mother, and wanting to just start off and naming that mostly this idea, and I think this is maybe a story or a narrative that comes in more like from behind, or is held as an unconscious belief, but is that like white women should be having children, and that like this level of reproduction is important and needs to be emphasized and and encouraged and protected. So like going into this idea of like who's a good mother and who's a bad mother, and who does mothering well and who doesn't do mothering well, and that these stories are so important and critical in understanding about how we think of ourselves as women and as mothers, connected to our own in particular racial identities and other intersections about what make up our identities as people who can have children. So starting from that point is this sense of I should be having children, right? Like that because I am a woman, because I can birth a baby, that there's something that is, even at this point, patriotic about having a child, about sustaining labor, about sustaining capitalism. And even without that kind of like framework or direct knowledge, even though I think most people have a felt sense of what their body means to the society, to the culture that we live in, but that this can go really directly into a sense of like urgency around needing to produce and produce children, because that's directly related to value, not only to the self, but to the society at large. And there's like a lot of different offshoots could go from there. But that sense of like my worth is tied to being a mother, I think is coming up more, you know, now than it has in many decades. And I don't think it even stops at having children, or having one child, for example. So in my practice, I've worked with women who are mothers and who terminated pregnancies after entering into motherhood, and who are still grappling with this feeling of not being enough, of not being good enough, of not doing motherhood right, because you could always do more. You could have more children. You could be a better mother in, infinite amounts of ways. And so I feel that there's this incredible dissonance between this story that's coming in that's saying, have children, be a mother. This is the most important thing you're going to do. This is going to give you value in our eyes as any outside witness and to yourself. And then I don't know this myself because I'm not a mother, but from my friends, from people who are in my practice, then you enter into that and the devaluation just continues. Like that there is no place that you reach where finally you're good enough, because you're never going to be a good enough mother. There's always going to be a reason to say that you're bad. And so this kind of like this phenomenon of being a bad woman or a good woman, and then being a good mother and a bad mother, and it just feels like there's no way to win. And if you're having a miscarriage, if you're having an abortion, if you're having a child who has high needs, or if you've only had one child, like I haven't really met many people who feel like they've done the thing and now they're like, oh, I'm fulfilled and I feel like I am valued by myself, by my partner, by my family, by my community, by my society. It just feels like there's this myth out there around motherhood. And that's not to take away from people who love being parents and, feel like they thrive in that role. And yet I think no one's free from the scrutiny of the patriarchy and what it means to mother and parent within that system.
As you were speaking, and it is a very Freudian but also Jungian concept that I often notice in my clients, especially around their sexuality, is that split between the Madonna-Whore complex.
Yeah.
And the Madonna being that like eternal good enough mother, good mother, like in all of the ways, and how I've noticed in so many of my clients, even though they don't resonate with that idea at the start of our work together, as we begin to unpick it, like right at the core, it doesn't matter if they are the most anti-oppressive, ideologically leaning person who has done as much excavating. Yep. There's oftentimes this and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not exactly fully firm on this language, but almost this religious tone of being the good mother, being the Madonna. And it's almost this deeply unconscious compulsion. And I catch it in myself time and time again. And then I'm like, oh, why am I splitting my sexuality? Why is it going back into two buckets? And I'm curious to hear from you how that plays out in your work, if anything I'm saying resonates, if there's places you want to add, because it is something where I think we start to really tie together sexuality with being a mother, and that often doesn't happen as well.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that you brought brought that up. And I was on my mind after the last time we spoke of being, oh yeah, and sex and sexuality and talking about embodiment and related to pregnancy and to abortion. I think, like an unplanned or undesirable reproductive experience, like whatever that might be on a wide spectrum or to whoever it might be, is one of the most maybe like unsexy things about sex and can really take us away from pleasure. And so I mean it's like going to the Madonna-Whore complex and this kind of religious undertone. I was just having this conversation the other day where it does feel like it's like be the virgin and give us children and do not be empowered. And I think like if we're talking about sexuality, there is a sense of being playful, being creative, being autonomous, setting boundaries, having, responding to other people's boundaries. And this is not in the, in the representation of this kind of religious mother who is just abiding and doting and sacrificial themselves. So yeah, I don't know if I got away from your question there, but
How do you support people in starting to unpick that in their own psyche when we start to bring up what are your unconscious reproductive narratives? Do you feel like you have to have children? Did you want to? Maybe you didn't want to, but you felt like you had to, or you've chosen not to, and now you have guilt. Because all of these pieces kind of go together, and I'd love to hear from you of how you start to unpick that in someone's psyche, or what are some signs that it is maybe a narrative inside their mind?
I mean, I get really curious about, especially after working with someone for a few months and kind of like getting a sense for like their voice, their tone, how they speak about themselves. And then all of a sudden hearing something that's like, who's that? Like, what? Like, I don't usually hear you use like those words or that language or that tone, or your volume changed. Like, really like tracking the voice and as a critical part of hearing someone's story. And so when I'm working with people, it's really just being like, oh, that's different. Who said that to you? Where did that come from? And a lot of people are really, some people it's very clear. It's like, oh, my mother told me this, or like this is my mother, and this is what I know about being a mother, and this is what has informed me about who I should be and why I should be a mother and what it should look like. And then there's this more like amorphous, figure of culture and society that has come out, or maybe from their religious background, but it's usually, not so pinpoint to a specific person. And I love doing this work, actually, of clarifying values and beliefs from internalized stories. And I think that kind of goes into parts work, because sometimes it more comes out in working with, the inner critic, working with the censor, the bully, whatever, kind of figure that resonates with the person. And also playing with time of being, there's something that maybe got concretized 5 years ago, and this is a belief that you had then, but does it still hold up now? And how can you today, who's having this very clear voice about what you believe about your own self-worth, how can that nurture or kind of like take over the bus, take over the reins, whatever it might be, to help guide you to walk in what your actual beliefs are? And I think another tool that I use is going into Kristen Neff's work of mindfulness, self-compassion, and I think it's a classic tool in self-compassion work where it's like, write a letter to yourself as if you're a friend. And I think in terms of clarifying values, this is really helpful, because it's like, if speaking to your best friend or your sister or someone that you love, is this what you believe about them? And if they're very clear, like, no, of course not. Like, I don't believe that, and I don't want that for other people or other women. It's like, okay, here's the signs that this is what you believe. And then now we need to look at like what's actually happening around I mean, for me, it's a sign of, putting oneself down, or self-hatred, or a lack of self-compassion or forgiveness or understanding of who these voices are and what role they're playing, actually, and how to clear them.
Have you noticed your clients be quite shocked? I've done some of that work with clients and I've received it, and I've, in my own personal therapy, been so surprised that like at the core those voices are so there. I'm like, oh my goodness, yes, I don't believe I have worth because of all these reproductive challenges I've been through, or because of this history. And it's so interesting how deep that voice is, and to find that it's not there. And is there any way that you support people with the shock of that when they do actually get in there and like, this is not how I would talk to anyone that I know, but yet this is like deeply what I believe about myself? What are the next steps of kind of unearthing that
Mm-hmm.
and supporting someone to change that voice?
Mm-hmm. It's funny bringing up shock. I find that this is a point where sometimes humor and laughter comes in, because it can feel so, when we really recognize something that's obvious, and it's like, oh my gosh. I mean, it can either feel a little bit like shameful of like, of course it's that, but it's also kind of funny to see, oh, we're so human. And this is, it's so hard to see the things that feel so obvious once they're revealed. And so I think just getting a little bit playful with people, because it can feel so, how could I be like, treating myself like that? So I think just really bringing some lightness and just some humility to this process of shock, of being like, and this happens to so many of us. And again, it's not something that, we kind of have this revelation and then it stays, unfortunately. But, and that's okay. And I think like for me, even it, when I think about my abortion history, it's like one of the first choices still that I could go down to is I'm terrible. Like, oh my gosh, I've done something really bad. Like, I'm 36. I don't have children. What does this say about me? Is my life mean it? And that choice is still there. I still see it very clearly. But now I see that I have all these other choices that I get to make.
That you brought that reference point in, because I was just the other day thinking about that, and I was, oh, that child would be literally the age that I got pregnant right
Mm-hmm.
now. And then I was like,
Oh, wow.
wow, that's
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
an interesting one to revisit. And then I
Mhm.
brought in the humor, which I love that you named, because in this topic it can feel so heavy and it's so loaded with so many systems and oppressive
Yeah.
ideologies that exist outside of us, that sometimes the use of dark humor or just playful
Yes.
humor can really just kind of shift it in such a way where it does reconnect us to our humanity and back to our body, which ties into another area that I would love to dive into with you, is how does this stuff really impact the relationship we have with our bodies? Yes, we have, as we've talked about, these pretty unconscious ideas deep down in there. Maybe we get exposed to them, we have some shock, we can put some
Mhm.
humor around them, but they kind of keep living there to some degree or another. Um, but how do they impact how we actually connect to the body that we live in? Because they don't just exist in our minds, as we both know.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when I'm hearing you speak right now is just a rigidity that comes in. And I mean, of course, we can have that in our thoughts, but we can have that in our body as well. And there's lack of inflexibility, rigidity, holding, contracting. And so I think there's so much value in trying to actually move the body. I mean, this is what we're kind of talking about, but there's a lot of folks that I see, they come in, they have some sort of, when we're talking about abortion, they go to like a pain that they have in their body, like shoulder pain, stomach pain. And so there's, various ways of working with that. I mean, a lot of people that I work with are just starting to see the connection between the pain that they have, and that when they go to the pain in their shoulder, that they cry and they don't know why they're crying. And for me, I remember when after my second abortion and my more challenging abortion, I was going to yoga, and I was getting into pigeon pose a couple times a week and just like sobbing every time I went into that pose. And I didn't really know what it was. Like, you could call it grief, loss, whatever, doesn't really matter, but there was a release there. And so I think guiding people towards exploring what the pain or sensation in the body has without then having to link it to something, which is very tempting to do. And I think this is one of the more uncomfortable parts of doing somatic work, which is the brain really wants to know, like, oh, the pain in my shoulder is this exact memory. And if I do this exact thing, then I'm going to release this emotion. And often it's so much bigger than that, not in a threatening way, but in a like a really kind of beautiful way of, of what actually the body holds. And I know a lot of people in my practice who are afraid to go into the body because they're afraid then that's going to mean what they think it means, which is that it's a really big deal, what's happened. And this part, like, I feel myself even now after I said it, just feel a little bit quiet and something kind of drop in me. And I think that's just the reverence for how it is scary to get confirmation from the body. And sometimes maybe what we feel will confirm a thought or a belief or a memory. And I think really going slow and steady with that with people. And I talk about a lot meaning making and storytelling, and then also recognizing there's a point in somatic work, I think, where we have to pull away from that a little bit and just let the sensations, let whatever is happening to be, and not go too quickly into making meaning or jumping to the conclusion about it. And so this is what I would say to somebody that I'm working with, and we're starting to go into what that shoulder pain is, what it feels like to have your stomach hurt as we're talking about your abortion.
I love that you named the bigness of it, and then when we go into the body, there is this, I would say, like almost instantaneous, like settling of this was a significant experience. Positive or negative is somewhat irrelevant, of just actually my mind's desire to minimize this story as something irrelevant in my history. The body is holding a different relevance to, regardless of outcome. And that's something that I've noticed a lot of my clients. I notice them struggle with. My clients who are having an abortion or that miscarriage was absolutely the best thing that happened to me, and I full-heartedly kind of believe that in my story, and I know that, and I sit with them and I can hear that, and I have those lived experiences. And yet when I go in my body, I'm confronted with this big sinking feeling, or this big pause, or this da-da-da, and then the mind like scrambling to go, well, does that mean something different? Does that mean that I have guilt? Does that mean I have sadness? Or da-da-da-da? And it just almost takes away from this.
Exactly.
I don't, how would you describe that, or that feeling? I'm not exactly sure. For me, it almost feels like a longing to be acknowledged in some way.
I don't know exactly what the word truth means in this, but something that's just, when we're in the presence of something that's true, also there is the longing, and just like when truth is starting to come out about something, I feel like things get kind of quiet.
Yeah.
And like a little bit more still, and that's also sometimes really unfamiliar place to be. Yeah.
Unfamiliar, and then the mind loves to kind of jump in and try and do its meaning-making thing. Staying with a little bit of the theme of the mind, I'm curious to hear from you how you support people to rewrite or reclaim their reproductive story when they've gotten into contact with one that doesn't serve them or doesn't fit. I'm imagining some of that rewriting comes from actually the pause that both of us are kind of feeling right now, but I would love to hear more about what that process is like.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful and delicate and like mysterious process sometimes too in rewriting a story, because sometimes it's very clear. Some clients really resonate with actually writing and journaling and wanting to go into this like into narrative therapy in a way, like they have their own relationship to how they understand how a story can change and unfold. And then other times I feel like I'm in active kind of construction site with people, and we're like looking around, and like the plans haven't really been laid yet, and like we know the like terrain because like here's the story. And what I found with people who are coming after their abortion in a particularly challenging experience is that they need to tell this story a lot. A lot. Like they're telling themselves this story a lot, whatever that first story is. And I think it comes in a very slow, invitational way of that, like, one, a story can get laid to rest completely, or we can like even like kill a story. There are many different possibilities of what to do with a story. But I start to focus on areas where people do take great pause, or like their energy changes. They're telling their story, and then all of a sudden they're like, but I remember XYZ and what he said. And here is a point where there's a real belief around what they know about themselves. And so I will stop and talk about this for a long period of time, or for a period of time, kind of exploring. And then as someone, is coming back to therapy and the story's coming up, and then that part might be left out, I might remind them, I remember last time in your story, there was this part. So I think part of it is being like sharing a memory in the story creating process with someone. And then they're like, oh yeah, I do remember that part of the story. That's a really important part of the story. And then noticing like people start the story at different places. They're not just going back to like the original point, but then now they start somewhere what could be considered the middle, or even at the end, and then work their way through different points. And really, again, highlighting a major focus on people trusting themselves. And when I hear that they've trusted themselves in their story, I will do like light fireworks. I will, do whatever I can to bring attention to these moments to help build a new foundation for the story, which is that I trust myself, I love myself, I forgive myself, and this is my abortion story. And so people have that in their stories. They all, like, I've never heard a story where that didn't exist. But it's about kind of being able to highlight and point out to someone like, well, what about this area? And this is what I saw happen in you when you talked about this part of your story. And then eventually, in a more classic way, there will be an exercise about like actually writing or telling the story, like going into this part. But I think in the nitty-gritty parts of what it means to be in a story with someone, I think that's part of it too. It's like you need to really be willing to be in the story with them.
I would love to focus on one of the three things you said. You said, I trust myself, I love myself, and I forgive myself. And the forgiveness piece, I want to focus in on specifically because of the climate that we're in around reproductive health.
Yes.
And because of that climate, I've noticed with some of my clients or just conversations with colleagues, that piece being very, very hard because there's such a strong push and so much judgment right now. It's like, well, I don't at all subscribe to any narrative that this was a wrong thing to do. And it's like, actually, that's not about it. It's this other piece of self-forgiveness of like, kind of last time I shared my experience of like needing to forgive myself for kind of being on this repetition compulsion with men who I knew weren't going to show up for me because of how that played out in my family system and my mother's experience of conception and such forth. How you work into that space of self-forgiveness to someone who is really pushing against the societal narratives that are so strong right now, how you hold that space for someone so that they can actually kind of find the piece of self-forgiveness that actually resonates with them. Because like you, those three things do stand out to me as highly valuable in processing the experience and coming back to self and creating that relationship with body again and all those beautiful things.
Yeah, forgiveness. I mean, just to share, I remember when I was sitting in Berkeley, where I used to live at at a park near my house, and I was talking to a friend, and I, for the first time in my life, said out loud, like, I don't know what forgiveness is. And somehow immediately it brought me to I didn't grow up religious or anything like this, so I actually don't have like the religious trauma from my own family system, which I'm grateful for. But what came up for me very organically in that moment is the word prayer, which isn't necessarily tied to something so loaded for me. But the question that followed is what is a prayer, and what does it mean to pray for something? And I think that this was the first thing that I really actually prayed for myself, was how do I, one, I was also in a place of needing to forgive someone else who had done something to me, but also to forgive myself. And it's still something that I'm in a deep inquiry about, and find new layers and new depths to forgiveness. And so I start there with people. What do you know about forgiveness? And I have like a little, in Clarissa Pinkola Estes, Women Who Run with the Wolves, she has a chapter that includes forgiveness, and it has the four stages of forgiveness, that I also love to use as my own reference, but with people as well. And it's incredible what asking a direct question can do. Of like, what does this actually mean to you? When have you been in a position where you needed to forgive? And I think that this part is really precious, again, because it's never about the abortion being wrong, or even that the decision needed to change. But it's about, how do I forgive myself for not knowing what I know now? And this is just like, man, we will cut ourselves up for not knowing what we know now, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, 10 years ago. And this I just like really need to make clear for people. And I talked about it last time, of like really protecting where you were, what age you were, what developmental stage you were at in your own process, like must be protected. This is part of the story that doesn't change, because this is just like the truth about your circumstances. And if we keep applying where you are now, where your relationship is now, how much more money you have now, how much more healing you've done, whatever it might be, like we're never going to get to the place of true compassion or forgiveness. And so it's exploring about like, what expectations are you putting on your past self? And what's that about? Like, how is punishment serving you? And can we let go of punishment for something else, which would be forgiveness? And I think people like that. I will say, like, it's something that people really soften to. And it's like any of this, and sometimes I don't want to hear this, and sometimes I feel bad telling people this, but it's like, it's gonna take practice, and we're gonna have to do it a lot. And it's actually something like, are you willing to and open to committing to and devoting to on this pursuit of resolution, whatever that might be for you after your abortion, but also, I mean, spanning out in general, of like, sometimes I really just ask people, do you want to love yourself? And some people are like, shit, how dare you ask me?
It ties into another question that I sometimes ask my clients is, do you want to experience pleasure?
Yeah.
Like, if we are to move pleasure into the body, it means that some of this self-hatred and self-judgment and blame and the things that are laid down from past experiences, let them be trauma, intergenerational patterns, like they have to be moved. So the question then becomes, do you want this? And if yes, what are you willing to start to really get into with, and maybe go into the not so comfortable stuff so that there is space for this? And I would love to hear from you how you support people to start moving love or pleasure back into their body when they have a reproductive history that maybe is painful in the body, or painful in the heart, or or just even confusing to hold.
Yeah. Well, first you reminded me of is There's a dancer choreographer from Israel. His name is Ohad Naharin, and he developed Gaga, of which one of my movement teachers here, Hugo Marmalada, he's a Gaga teacher. And in that space, there is one of the central tenets that comes through is that there can be pleasure in discipline and pleasure in effort. And that like it can feel like working hard doesn't just have to be like, damn, this sucks, like this hurts. It can be like we can work hard, and it can be like, oh, like I'm like in it, I'm like stretching myself, I'm really like using my body, or I'm like using my spirit or my psyche. And so I don't know, just like this idea of the intersection of pleasure and effort has been really interesting and beautiful to me. And I think like that's a very important part, because I even think like before my own real like deep dive into this for myself, there was an idea like, well, if it's pleasureful, it should be effortless. Like it should just come. I should just like it, and it should just feel good. And if it doesn't, then that's not really what it is. And that was like a huge block, because actually in terms of experiencing things that I pleasure, there was some effort I had to put forth to gain access to pleasure again, especially after abortion. I mean, not only just related to erotic or sexual pleasure, but because I spent really like 2 years after my second abortion really punishing myself. And what I found is that like when I'm punishing myself, there is no room for pleasure. There's just absolute, like that is just not something that I think I even deserve or could even think about or hear. And so I think moving people out of the I need to suffer, I need to be punished, I need to be bad is the first step in reclaiming pleasure. And then, you know, just pleasure in general, like talking about like what, I mean, I know you know this as well, but just taking pleasure into like food, into, you know, entertainment, like what are the things that actually just feel good? And I notice that when I ask people what brings you pleasure, they feel oftentimes, more often than not, they feel uncomfortable because they think I'm just talking about sex right away. And although like we of course will, typically it does end up going there if we're talking about the body or reconnecting with partners after having an abortion or a child or a miscarriage. You know, also like zooming out and being like, I mean, I see the beautiful flowers that are behind you right now, which evokes like a sense of pleasure. So I think it's also helping people broaden their sense of what being in pleasure is for them. And do they deserve pleasure? And did they think that they deserved pleasure before their abortion? Like when did this idea of I don't get to be in joy in my body or in my environment, when did that story come in? Because that might be a lot older than the abortion.
I want to loop what you're saying now back to something you said earlier about how unsexy unplanned pregnancy is, or an unplanned termination is, whatever that ends up, and loop it to this idea of punishment, and then how there does need to be this effort to reclaim sexuality, yes, but also to reclaim pleasure. And I've noticed this as you were speaking, it like touched on parts of my own story after having unplanned pregnancy, and then for like 5 years just like punishing myself in any said way that I could. It was, you know, through different forms of therapy that were definitely just, I don't know, it was just kind of cruel on myself to keep excavating in that way, or choosing relationships that I definitely didn't see a future with because I just didn't feel deserving of a future with someone after that experience. And I would love to hear from you how you start to kind of work with someone on that link, because it's something I noticed in my practice is this, I've had these experiences and maybe I don't even acknowledge that there's judgment here, but I'm actually removing myself from pleasure. I'm putting myself in situations where this isn't really what I want, but like that's fine. And then also this really strong disbelief that pleasure requires effort. And I know that for myself, it's been a hard and continual practice to actually take in pleasure, to find it, and to feel it. I believe I'm worthy of it, but nonetheless, my system still has these unconscious imprints of, ooh, I don't really know, or like it's gonna actually take you like a lot of time to like find your way there, because there's still this sense of, are you sure? Are you sure it's okay to feel this? So I'd love to hear how you support someone in that process, because you did articulate it so lovely, and I'm sure that there's listeners who can resonate with aspects of that. And this type of knowledge, I'm going to go out on a bridge here maybe, or a ledge, is not so accessible. It's
Yeah.
not easy to find a clinician who can actually articulate this knowledge that works with it. And so I'd love to hear more from you about this process.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, gosh, like nothing can feel more punishing sometimes than repeating a cycle.
Yes,
And I mean,
it's true.
I thank you so much. I would just want to say, like, thank you so much for speaking about your own like repetition with like choosing the wrong partner and miscarriage. I mean, I've had that. I mean, I've looked at that myself and being like, wow, like I've done, I've had 4 abortions. I have also like repeated something like, around the birth control choices I was making or not making and scenarios that I got into, or like ways, that I was in a little bit of denial about things before and believed something might be true, but I knew it wasn't true. And so it feels really good to just hear someone else say that. Thank you.
I also, from being a clinician, have heard so many women speak of that. And because I do think there is such an unconscious and implicit imprint in the reproductive stories that we were born into, the ones that we carry through us, and then the ones that we live out, that in the same way that we acknowledge that we'll keep kind of dating a quote unquote toxic partner who
Yeah.
mirrors someone who harmed us in the past, I have always found this quite curious, since my own analyst brought it to my awareness of like, why aren't we having that conversation around our sexual partners, the people we choose to have reproductive experiences with? Why isn't this being brought to light? Because when I looked at my history, I was like, wow, this started with my mother, and at 16, like it dug real deep into me. And at 25, it hit its climax point. And I'm so glad I had a clinician who could just stop me and be like, you're repeating something, and do you want to keep repeating it? Because this looks really fucking painful over there.
Yeah.
But it's always shocked me that there isn't a lot of narrative around that piece.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think even that, to just have a clinician who's gonna like be willing to confront you with love and say like, listen, like you just described something that you've been doing for the last 5 years. Like, do you want to keep doing this for the next 5? Which can feel like, what?
It's supposed to be on my side. Where's the
Yeah,
empathy?
well, yeah, like,
She had it.
collude with me, merge with me. And it's like to have someone just even do that is like, whoa, that's awesome. It's brave. I think it's brave to do that as a clinician also. Like even in my own experience of asking those hard questions and pointing out like the really unsavory cycles that we get ourselves into, and be like, here it is. Here's this. Like, what are we going to do? What do you want to do? What do you think we can do? And I'm going to go back again to this dance and I'll just say, like, in my work clinically, like, I love this question. It's still something I'm figuring out, like, what do I do? And it feels different with each person, and it feels like something that's like developing. But in my dance class with my teacher Hugo, like, he's exploring how to break out of patterns physically. That like when I start to dance, I always raise my right shoulder first, and like this is where I start my dance. These are the moves that I feel comfortable doing. This is like my own groove. And the whole point of this exploration in his class, in the frame of Gaga, is finding how like there's so many other ways that you can dance right now, and like can we research this together so that we're getting out of our patterns and that we can find more. There's just like even more ways that we can dance. And so this I think is really helpful for me. Well, it's been incredible for me in my own exploration of okay, like if I'm always sitting like this and I'm trying to tell you a different story about who I am and what I see, it's just not going to work. We need to also bring the body in and say, like, can we change? It doesn't need to be as radical as going to a dance class, or if that's radical for someone, but it can also just be changing the posture in your chair and making another choice. What are the things that we're constantly going towards? And if someone in my practice is like talking about wanting to make change, but they're not changing how they're sitting, what the friends that they're walking around with, the partners that they're choosing, the way that they're walking to work, like all of these things. And it's like we've got to look beyond just like what you and I are able to talk about here together. And are you willing actually to do the therapeutic work outside of therapy? I think is a huge question too. Because like this is, you and I are together for an hour a day, an hour a week, maybe two. And how can we look at the other places in your life that you can bring in things like pleasure, that you can bring in a new activity, that you can bring in a new rhythm, a new pattern, a new tone, a new texture, a new quality to your life? Because if we're just gonna talk about the change and the pattern, then I'm just getting embedded in the pattern with you. And so I think it's also being willing to say, like, we've got to talk about like what you're doing outside of therapy. And I think when you're like a young clinician and you want it to happen in the therapy room, and a lot does happen there, but it's also now being like, and like, let's really talk about like, what are the other changes that you're willing to make in your life to bring in pleasure, to bring in support, to bring in connection, to meet
I,
different kinds of people.
I love that you brought this up. When I got registered with ASEX, so as a registered sex therapist, right at the time I just had this influx of clients who wanted to work with me because they wanted pleasure, they wanted an
Mhm.
orgasm, or they had gone through a miscarriage and couldn't feel portions of their cervix. And they're like, oh my goodness, a sex therapist with all these fancy tools.
Uh-huh.
And I did that work for maybe about, I think I lasted about 6 months with that type of client.
Yeah.
And then exactly what you are saying came out inside me, where it was like, actually, I could give you the knowledge that you could actually probably also just find in a Cosmo. It's probably there. It's probably not the best version of the
Mhm.
knowledge, but it's there. But that's not actually the work. The work is finding all of the ways inside your system
Yeah.
where every single day when you're out there in that world, you deprioritize your own pleasure and
Yes.
more commonly prioritizes someone else's well-being or pleasure or safety or ease or whatever it is, and put yourself second.
Yeah.
And that for me was a definite change in my practice, where I just kind of stopped in many ways believing that I had that type of, I don't want to say power because that's not exactly
Yeah.
the right word,
Yeah.
where I believed that therapy was that potent to change someone's life. I began to saw it as just a place where I could sprinkle things that I would deeply hope that my clients would water when they left the room,
Mm-hmm.
especially around the conversations of pleasure, and especially
Yeah.
around these conversations of how do I view my body? What is the reproductive history inside my body? Just sprinkling these things, and hoping that when they go out there, they have another conversation, they talk to someone else, they prioritize their pleasure. And I'm curious to hear from you if 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 this does resonate, and B, what are some of the things that you find yourself maybe trying to sprinkle in on your clients? Sometimes I'm like, I'm just planting seeds over here all day. Like, I don't know what your garden's going to be full of, but like, I'm trying to make it great.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I love that. I mean, the seeds that the word that comes, although it feels reductive, is the word hobbies. And I'll say a personal, like years ago, like I guess it was 3 years ago now, I was in a huge transition in my life, and was yeah, stuck. There was just a lot going on, which I could go into another time. But my therapist every session kept being like, "You need to get a hobby. Like, what are you doing with your time?" And I was like, "If you tell me to get a hobby one more time, like I am gonna like end this therapy." And he never stopped. And then I was very resistant to doing it. And then at some point, I started like picking up I started being curious about what was fun for me and what felt playful and what I could learn and how that connected to my self esteem, how it connected me to other people, what groups it got me involved in. And then all of a sudden I was like, dang, I'm doing all these new hobbies. And I'm so grateful for that. I mean, that was a very direct, seed that was planted. And I think I try to do that for people that I'm working with. I love it wondering about possibilities with people. And I share like I share my hopes for the people that I'm working with. Like when I hear that, they want their life to go in some direction and start imagining together like, oh wow, like I wonder, you said that you used to do like improvisation. Like what could that look like or feel like, or how does that show up in your relationship? And sometimes it's like people are naming what it is that they could actually start watering again. And I think it's just about, for me, it's getting curious and wondering about it, but also getting into the imagination of what's possible. What could things look like? What's something that what's a small change that you could just make, right now, like today, like this week, that could bring in more pleasure, more beauty? What's something that also could make it easy? It's maybe less of a seed sprinkling, but this is a new question I'm working with. Is like the work is hard, and like where are the places that it can be easy? And that's been kind of like a fun exploration with people.
I like that question specifically in the context of what's moving in the world right now and being all feeling very hard and very heavy of like, where can I find these gentle spots of it being easy? As you were sharing about your therapist, I also had a therapist who, for years, asked me what I did every week for play. And I hated this question. And she would start the therapy with it, and it would make me so angry because I
Yeah.
like didn't even know what play was. And I was like, why is she
Yeah.
keep asking me this stupid question?
Yeah.
Let me talk about my trauma.
Yes.
She just didn't want to hear it. And I would love to hear from you just the importance of play and creativity, or making things easy or experiencing ease in the process of reclaiming the body or making a relationship with the body, after an experience of reproductive health that's been challenging. What is the role of those things in coming back after an experience like that, but also just having vitality in the body as well?
I mean, moving people towards creativity, I think, is a really, in general, but after abortion is really essential. And I had this kind of revelation after my third abortion of like, my body was creating something in a very literal way. There was cells, there was things, coming together. And then I did, end that process. And that something around like this urge towards creativity felt both extremely intimidating and threatening at times and really exciting and enticing. And this kind of feeling like, do I deserve that? Like, do I deserve to be creative after I've ended one creative process? Can I begin another creative process? And so I think capturing creativity after an abortion is a wonderful way to work with the energetics of pregnancy and of terminating the pregnancy. And so getting into like what ritual is a form of play. So oftentimes kind of going into like what's your idea about ritual? A lot of people kind of scoff at it, but recognizing like this is something that you get to play with. Like this could also be a form of play in a way that you get to communicate either like you know, some people really resonate with the spirit baby realm and having kind of like allies in the kind of like beloved spiritual, like either like beloved dead or like in the spirit realm, and how to be in a process of like creative communication and honoring and intention setting and receiving support. So that's one kind of like avenue that can go through with people, that I see really brings a lot of lightness and a sense of play, like being in my imagination and being able to create the world where what I've done is free from punishment. It's free from anything but actually like me making this decision that was good for me, and actually that this spirit that I'm connected to is an ally to me. Not only like is it just a neutral like fine thing that I did, but that I could be guided. I could be being guided by this process, and that for me is like whoa, like this is a whole, like talk about, you know, story changing everything. It feels like this whole realm of like creation and play, and like this is the world that people get to make up for them, not make up, this is the world that people get to create for themselves after abortion. It doesn't have to be exactly these words, but like it, like you do not have to live in the world of the Trump administration or like any of these. This is a sick, nasty world, and like you do not have to live there. And in fact, like we can create this other beautiful world that we can use words like portals and growth and healing and reclaiming and guiding and like pleasure and connection. Like this is the world that we can live in post-abortion.
I love that you brought up two pieces. One, the continued creativity, regardless of its abortion, miscarriage, medical termination,
Yeah.
that there is this creation process inside the body. And I absolutely adore some of the research that shows that the brain chemistry continues to changes, that there's continued hormonal changes that actually extend into a 9-month period, even if you
Yes.
have your medical termination or your abortion and your miscarriage at early as 6 weeks, that you're still in this process. I
Mhm.
know when I found out that piece of knowledge, I was like, oh my goodness, everything makes so much sense. Why
Yeah.
I just wrote like da 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 da, or like why I started painting again, and these like big moments that almost felt kind of manic. When I look back, I'm like, I'm a pretty like swoosh person, but it was
Uh-huh.
like this. I was like, oh, that was that energy moving through me. And I love that you brought it up because it's something that I so wish more people knew about. So
Hmm.
I'm going to ask you a question about that. And
Okay.
then we go back to spirit babies because
Yeah.
also another topic that I adore. So, if someone is feeling that creative energy, how do you support them with that? Because it can be a lot. Are there pieces of psychoeducation that you offer? Um, how do you kind of bring up that conversation with someone?
Yeah. Well, I bring up like I'm glad to know that there's literature on this, because I've often thought of it. I've called it the parallel pregnancy phenomenon, and
Mm,
I've recognized that like the abortion experience is as long as, you know, like it carries until 9 months, and generally like there's like a shift in perception or like a felt sense that can change for people once like the due date has passed. And of course like there are these moments like you just said, like wow, my daughter would have been 16, like the age that so like these moments, these milestones, there was all these like little like parallel kind of lives going on that we live after pregnancy loss. And so I try to just extend